not only in America are we having a big debate about China, but in the West generally, and China, although a more closed society, less transparent, certainly shows signs of having considerable disagreement even among the elite about the current Xi Jinping policy. Now, in this debate, people are asking some critics of our current situation, did we make a mistake in the 70s and 80s in responding to the request of the People's Republic to cooperate with them, to help them recover from the terrible, terrible damage, not only of the Cultural Revolution's decade, but also of the decade that preceded that. The country was in bad shape. It had some strong elements, to be sure, but until Deng Xiaoping took control in '78 after Mao's death in September '76, class struggle continued to be the dominant theme, and Deng turned that around, featured the open policy, as you all know. Reform was to take place, modernization was on people's minds, but the problem was how to do it. And one of the biggest obstacles that China confronted was the legal system's absence. Lawlessness had prevailed at many periods in the previous 30 years. Foreigners were well aware of that. China was eager for foreign investment, foreign loans, foreign technology, as well as trade. And foreigners wanted to have some security, some assurance. China was a black box, and the Chinese government knew that they had to at least appear to have some semblance of a legal system. And the problem was how to do it. I remember in April '79 meeting with Vice Premier Li Shenyan, who had a lot to do with economic development. I asked him some questions about the rumored joint venture investment law that they were planning, and I had helped them have some lectures with previous month. And he got annoyed with me and he said, look, you foreigners don't have to worry about business law. We Chinese have to worry because we don't know anything about it. And I could see the insecurity on their side at least matched the insecurity on our side. And the problem was what to do. I remember meeting at that time a very smart young man who ultimately studied law in America, as was his goal. And I said to him, he worked for the Ministry of Machine Building in Shanghai in the law and contract department. And I said, why do you want to study law in America? He said, very simple. He said, every day I'm negotiating as an interpreter with Volkswagen about constructing a joint venture in China. And we in the law and contract division of our ministry have only one problem. I said, what's that? He said, we don't know anything about law or contracts. So they were desperate, they were hungry, and we were eager. We'd been waiting a long time. And I had started in 1960 to study China, only got there in '72. The visits during the '70s were all very superficial. They treated me very politely. I was a Harvard professor, but they never told me anything. And I wanted to learn what really happened. And the only way to do that was to live there, to work there. And we finally got an opportunity in the summer of '79 after I put on a couple of programs for the Ministry of Finance on taxation and for the China Council for the Promotion of International Trade on business law, to give a course for the Beijing Economic Development Corporation. And I recruited my dear friend and former student, Steve Orlins, with whom we have a chance to talk today, to join me in Beijing. Steve had been interested in China since his undergraduate days at Harvard. I remember the late Professor James Thompson called me up and introduced Steve in his senior year, Steve's senior year, and we became friends. Steve went off to Taiwan for a year where he improved his Chinese. He learned to sing Chinese opera as well as share Mao Tai and other drinks, etc. He came back to Harvard Law School, worked on China in a very impressive way, and his timing was excellent. 1976, he finished law school, got a job in the State Department legal advisor's office. They needed a China specialist because they were preparing finally to accomplish the normalization of formal diplomatic relations that Nixon had started but never completed. And after Steve joined, the Carter administration made good use of him for several years, including after normalization on the Taiwan Relations Act problems. At that point, I persuaded Steve to try another adventure, not formal diplomatic, but informal business law in China. And we then spent the next couple of years working with the Beijing Economic Development Corporation. It was the Economic Commission of Beijing City. They were willing to take a chance on foreigners at a time when most Chinese were still nervous about associating themselves with law and American law people. So this was an exciting adventure. It gave us the opportunity we had long been waiting for to learn more about reality of Chinese life and law on the ground. And it gave us a chance to be useful in terms of improving the lives of the Chinese people. So that's the background for this. And I want to hear what Steve's thoughts are. He's become, since he left our effort, he became a distinguished investment banker, charge of a major firm's Hong Kong, Asia office. And he then, recent years, has been the president of the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations, where he's had the highest level informal, non-official contacts with China's leaders and the problems that we discussed today. So with that background, Steve, were we wrong to help the Beijing Economic Development Corporation? Did we create a Frankenstein whose consequences we now have to deal with? What's on your mind?
Well, thanks for the introduction. I mean, thanks for the opening. Obviously, I'm in Manhattan, surrounded by a pretty unhappy situation. But one of the kind of silver linings to these dark clouds is finally one of our interchanges are going to be recorded by Zoom. So we've done these lunches over the many years talking about China and talking about our relationship. But this one, I've always wanted them to be recorded, and this one will be recorded. So that's fabulous. When you first asked me that question, I kind of went, really? People are asking that? They couldn't have spent much time in Asia prior to that period or been in China in 1979. I talk about Asia generally because, as you know, I got into the study of Chinese because of the war in Vietnam. So I think in part what we were doing was helping to create rule of law in China so that we wouldn't have a Vietnam again. That after we established diplomatic relations with China, obviously China did then have a very quick and bloody war with Vietnam. But subsequent to that, for the last 41 years, we've had peace in Asia. And if you think about the prior 5 decades, we had 250,000 American soldiers die on the battlefields of Asia. So kind of first is, hey, we've had peace. And part of what we did then was we contributed to peace. So that's point one. Point two is we participated in one of the great endeavors of human history, which was raising from poverty, helping to raise from poverty hundreds of millions of Chinese. I mean, I still remember clearly the night I arrived. So I left the State Department. We flew from New York to Tokyo, Tokyo to Shanghai, Shanghai to Beijing on October 19th, 1979. It's about 1 a.m. You know, Lao Sun picked us up at the airport, which was the old Beijing airport. We've had now, actually the third iteration of that airport is now up and operating. But from the drive from the airport to the Beijing hotel where we're to live for the next 20 months, we didn't pass one car. We passed ox carts, we passed trucks. It's just a statement. It's a reflection of the economic development of China at that point in time. And what we did is we helped in China's economic development. I remember shortly after we arrived, Susan Orlins and I went up to, Dongbei, and we went cross-country skiing. And there was no indoor plumbing. There was no running water. The poverty was in front of your nose. What we did is we helped lift those places out of poverty. That helping the Chinese create rule of law helped enable them to lift these hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. To kind of sit there and say, well, you did the wrong thing. I kind of go, really? So helping lift hundreds of millions of people out of poverty is bad, regardless of what it did for US-China relations, what it did from the United States. But I would argue we actually did tremendous good for the United States. So you talk to the machinist at Boeing, he would argue, you guys helped raise my pay. You helped us employ many, many more people. You talk to Caterpillar, you talk to GM, you talk to Apple. You can talk to hundreds of thousands of American workers who would say that what we did benefited the American people, didn't hurt them. Now today, because the focus is so much on China's unfair trade practices, many would argue that is not the case. I also would say that what we've lost sight of in the debate today, that the asking of this question is the China, Jerry, that you and I went to in 1979 is not the China today. And I don't mean that in the sense that it's worse. I mean it in the sense that it's better. Of course, we don't agree with China's human rights policies today, with rule of law today, that it hasn't developed in a way that we would want it to. However, it is tons better than what it was in 1979. You remember a student who graduated from the university then, the few who kind of entered after the Cultural Revolution, they didn't get to choose where they lived or where they worked. They got to be fun pay. They were assigned to where they were supposed to work. They were assigned to where they were going to live. Judges then, I mean, if you remember the judges then, they were retired army officials who had no legal training. Today, even though we don't agree with a lot of what's going on, the judges are better trained, and we helped kind of in bringing that to China. We've also lost sight, obviously, shortly after, when we arrived in China, there was democracy wall. So every morning we were living at the Beijing hotel, and we'd walk over and we'd look at the Dazabao. And soon after the arrival, all of a sudden, it was all the Dazabao were taken down. Wei Jingshan was arrested. You know, there were a crackdown on kind of free expression in China. So the expression, what had gone on is we'd seen kind of a loosening of rules, and then we saw a tightening of rules. And what's happened over the last 40 years is, as we've seen that happen many times. We saw it in the Jinshan Wuran campaign, the spiritual pollution campaign. Obviously, we saw it in Tiananmen. We've seen it repeatedly. What we've lost sight of today is with the human rights, the rule of law violations, the human rights violations that the Chinese government is engaging in is, number one, it's sadly not the first time. Number two, it moves up and down. It's not, you have to draw a line through it to see the progress. I mean, I'm fond of quoting Martin Luther King, the arc of the moral universe bends slowly, but it bends towards justice. I think it does bend towards justice. And even in China, where we're seeing a downward trend, we've lived through this before, and ultimately the people decide that they want a loosening. The people decide they want more free expression. The people decide they need more freedom to do their research in order to get progress in the society. So we've seen these before, and as dark as it can be, we have to look at the history since 1979 and conclude that it will improve over time.
You've given us quite a few topics for discussion. I agree with what you say about the pendulum-like development. I pointed that out in my 1968 book on the criminal process, which was published in the worst days of the Cultural Revolution. And I said, this too shall pass. The Chinese people will not settle for this. There will be a reaction. And it took until Deng Xiaoping attained power to see that reaction. And what we can see maybe in our defense also, you could say, is how adventitious, how uncertain the course of history in China is. When you think back, China had a reforming general secretary of the party, leader of the country, Hu Yaobang, in the mid-80s. And it was his overthrow in 87 that started a bad trend, but he was succeeded, of course, by another very able reformer, Zhao Ziyang. If he had not fallen on just before June 4th, 1989's massacre, things would have been different. I think about also how important leadership is in China in the 90s. I was very impressed with Prime Minister Jerome A. He understood contracts. He understood the importance of living up to a legal system. If he had reached the top rung, I think we would have seen a different trend. But as you point out, there have been good periods. Most recently, you could say 2003, 4, 5, when law reform was very important. And in recent years, I think the Xi Jinping increasing dictatorship is creating a reaction, and this too shall pass. But
by the way, Jerry, let me add that the idea that we stand back and watch this happen is wrong. So I'm not meaning to suggest that we don't criticize, we don't participate. In fact, it's the exact opposite. Kind of the end, the Obama addition to the Martin Luther King quote is we bend that arc by putting our hands on it and moving it. So the idea is you participate in moving towards a better society for all. And you don't do it by standing back and saying, well, it'll change. That's not what I'm suggesting.
Well, here we're now veering toward the present and the future, and we can incorporate that into the discussion, certainly. I've developed for simplistic public speaking purposes in the last few weeks the idea of the 4 C's. I don't mean SEAS, I mean letter C's. And by that, I mean we need a balanced approach to China, and I emphasize cooperation. We can't give up on cooperation with China, and we can talk about those areas where it's a must. Despite the current thing, we're inevitably going to have a second C, competition with China, whether in diplomacy or in business. But we have competition with our European allies in many respects. The third C I have is criticism. I think we have to keep up our public criticism of things such as you mentioned, the human rights suppression, which is awful in Xinjiang, and human rights lawyers and freedom of speech, etc. And finally, we have to continue to have some containment militarily. We can't give up on our military posture. We can't let the other countries of Asia that don't want to be left alone with China. We haven't a need to be provocative, but we can't give that up either. So we need a balanced approach, and we have to bear in mind that our policy is crucial. International law is interactive, foreign policy is interactive, and unless we have an administration that can overcome the current policies that we have in Washington, we're going to be hindered in our approach to China. That's clear. Let's talk.
I mean, Jerry, let me respond to your 4 C's. I think they're the first 3 are truly great, and I agree with them. And what we've done is we've, to a large degree, lost sight of the need to cooperate, especially in the coronavirus era. That the government, the civil society continues to cooperate, scientists continue to cooperate, and governments are not, and that is very dangerous. I think competition. I really think you need to look at slightly differently, and I've always looked at. I think Harry Harding many years ago gave a talk about the 3 levels of competition. The first level is diplomatic competition. We have diplomatic competition with lots of countries. That's absolutely fine. Economic competition is fine. We compete with the Canadians. We compete with the Brits. That's fine. Strategic competition. When you define the relationship as strategic competition, it becomes dangerous because it requires the governments to take actions which actually hurt their respective peoples. So if we're in this, the way this administration defines it, this strategic competition with China, it means that economic competition takes on a different kind of framework, that there are many areas where we cannot cooperate. It means that diplomatic competition, our participation in various international organizations is different. I think the strategic competition, in fact, doesn't exist. I think strategic competition for me means existential. Is the Chinese system an existential threat to the United States? Is the US system an existential threat to China? And I say no, actually neither is. And we need to be careful not to define this as a strategic competition, because when you do, your ability to influence Chinese policies on the things that we care about, whether it's Hong Kong, Xinjiang, human rights, economic policy, South China Sea, you name it, becomes almost impossible because it's viewed in the framework of this strategic competition. If you say we have differing interests in the South China Sea, with Taiwan, with Hong Kong, but it is not in the framework of the strategic competition, our ability to influence China is enhanced, not lessened. And that's kind of the danger. Then you get into containment. If it's containment, if we're really seeking to contain China, that word obviously resonates with our policy towards the USSR when it still existed. If that's it, that's going to lead to certain things which will cause the Chinese to respond. So it becomes what I would say is a self-fulfilling prophecy. The strategic competition that this administration has defined the relationship as has led to a downward spiral in the relationship. We do something, the Chinese do something, we do something, the Chinese do something, and it's a spiral downward. And I think that was wrong. In 2017, when that national security strategy was written, I disagreed with it. First of all, I think China, compared to the United States, is not a revisionist power. I would argue, in fact, the revisionist power today might be the United States as we withdraw from the Iran agreement, as we withdraw from a variety of international institutions, whereas the Chinese are trying to bend those international institutions to what they want. But to call them a revisionist power, I think that actually was inaccurate. And I also don't think defining it as a strategic competition is in the interest of the American people. It's also leading, obviously we've spent so much money on coronavirus aid, it's hard to now complain about a defense budget that is out of control. in order to kind of be able to prepare for the strategic competition with China. But I continue to believe that it is out of control.
That's all extremely helpful, but it leads to the question, you mentioned the USSR. Despite our strategic competition with them, we did have a number of very successful negotiations that helps ease the security tensions between us. We don't see that happening with China now. On arms control, for example, the Chinese don't even want to talk to us and the Russians because they have so much less in the way of nuclear power. What are the prospects for negotiations on a strategic competition basis? We see the question is, how are we going to reconcile our interests in the South China Sea and the East China Sea? Isn't it going to be possible, because many of us, and I hope the next administration in Washington, want to improve relations, don't like the current trend, which is more dangerous than anything we've seen in the last half century in US-China relations. What are the prospects for serious negotiations? We have endless negotiations about business, economics, trade, investment. But what about negotiation about security? After World War I in Asia, there were some serious Washington-type conferences, etc., even with a rising Japan. Are there prospects here that the Chinese are prepared, and are we going to be prepared for serious negotiations that will ease the security questions?
I would say in the current environment, that's deeply problematic. I think in the long term, we should be able to see a code of conduct in the South China Sea that, it's ultimately, it's one of those things, it's ultimately in China's interest to do that. It's not something which, the China is not going to want bad relations with the Philippines, Vietnam, Singapore, Indonesia over these disputed claims. Whereas maybe 30 years ago, the resources that could have been taken from those areas would be material to China. As China has grown, as its GDP has become so large, the resources are actually, in the context of China's economy, not very big. So what should happen is we should move towards a code of conduct in the South China Sea, and then we should see joint development of the resources there with the Chinese, the claimant states, the other claimant states, and with likely US energy companies participating in exploiting those resources. And that would be a solution. So it's not that it's something, again, I don't see it as existential. I can see if as further deterioration in the relationship, further strategic competition, it becomes existential. But right now, if we could step back, if we could kind of put a pause on this strategic competition, if Vietnam, the Philippines, Indonesia, Singapore, and others could negotiate with the Chinese a code of conduct, and we could start jointly exploiting those resources, that problem would be somewhat mitigated. In the current environment, I think that's highly unlikely.
That sounds good, except the history of negotiations over the code of conduct does not inspire confidence in some of us, and certainly not in the Southeast Asian ASEAN states. It's easier said than done. I remember when the head of the Chinese foreign relations apparatus, Mr. Yang, at one of these conferences reminded the other countries, remember China, he said, we're a very big country. And that disturbs a lot of people.
I guess because my first professional experience was working on the establishment of diplomatic relations with China. And everyone, was saying it just, it had been frozen, as you pointed out, it had been frozen since President Nixon's trip. Secretary Vance didn't make any progress when he went to China in '77. Everybody said, well, it's not going to happen. You know what it takes? It actually only takes one thing. It only takes one thing, Jerry. It takes leadership.
Yeah.
It takes a leader who knows that ultimately this is in the long-term interests of the people. So Deng Xiaoping made the decision. It was in the interest of the people of the United States. People of China. Jimmy Carter made the decision. It was in the interest of the people of the United States. And they got together. And the result of that has been 40 years of peace. And Taiwan has continued to thrive. Everybody said, how are you going to do this? How are you going to maintain all these international agreements with Taiwan after we've broken diplomatic relations? How are you going to continue to issue visas? How are you going to, well, it just took President Carter's leadership to tell the State Department, which ultimately told me, set up the American Institute in Taiwan as a 501c3 in Washington, which will then allow us to do these things on an unofficial basis. So we didn't violate the terms of the announcement of the agreement of establishment of diplomatic relations, but we did preserve our relations with Taiwan. And what we did, and everybody said it was impossible. What I learned living on Taiwan after Nixon's visit was it was the unknown that was hurting Taiwan's development, that people didn't know, that they knew someday the United States was going to break diplomatic relations and establish relations with China. But it was that unknown. Were they going to be able to continue to do business? Were the people's lives going to be jeopardized? And the answer is, we did it. We did it. Taiwan has thrived over those many years. It has become a democracy in part because we dealt with that unknown.
Now, all of that is very good and draws, I think, appropriately on our historical experience with China. But Deng Xiaoping was a different leader from the current Chinese leadership. Deng Xiaoping was amazingly flexible as well as imaginative. Look at what he did with one country, two systems. That was an unbelievable amount of flexibility. Look how he told the Japanese, well, we can't solve the Diaoyu Senkaku Island dispute in this generation. Let's get on with cooperation and leave that to the future. Look what he did about our normalization with Beijing when he didn't solve the arms for Taiwan question. We still haven't solved the arms for Taiwan question, but he let it go to another day. Now we have a leadership in Beijing that says we will never compromise on 1 inch, etc. It's totally different attitude. And we have our own problems, as you say, in getting our house in order. But with that Chinese diplomatic attitude reflecting China's greater power in the world, negotiations aren't going to be so easy. You need flexibility, you need imagination, and as you point out, you need the will to recognize for strategic reasons, we need to have peaceful cooperation. Not in everything, we can't do it in everything. But
I would say on Taiwan, your former student recognized that. And we did see enormous progress in cross-strait relations during the presidency of Ma Ying-jeou.
yes,
And we ultimately saw even a meeting between Ma Ying-jeou and Xi Jinping. So is the hardening of the policy based upon China's changing its position, or is it based upon Taiwan's changing its position? And do we need leadership on both sides of the strait to kind of reorient that policy towards a productive policy? Clearly, right now, it's not, I had hoped after Tsai Ing-wen became president and gave, I thought, a good inauguration speech that China would say, okay, we'll proceed with the policies that we adopted when Ma Ying-jeou was president. They obviously chose not to do that.
they said her paper didn't really warrant a good grade.
Yes, I remember well. And obviously that was, so it's hard to know.
I think Taiwan has tried to be flexible under Tsai, but the key point, as you so well know, is China insists on a formulation where the Taiwan government would give up the future option of formal independence. And that's what's at the nub of that. But even there, we're managing to continue despite disturbing signs in terms of the PRC's attitude toward Taiwan lately. Before we move on to questions, I wanted to deal with a couple of other points. One is, I don't think we should ignore, and you certainly don't, despite the repression of Xi Jinping, which seems to be increasing in many respects, legal reform continues to sort of putter along quietly in China. We now have a totally different situation from 40 years ago, when you and I landed in Beijing to start giving instruction to these 30 officials who faced legal problems every day. Legal education hadn't really resumed in a significant way in China. Now you have over 600 law schools turning out an elite that until recently under Xi Jinping featured Western-style liberal legal rule of law values, even though the graduates then had to confront a very different environment when they finished law school. And these people, many of them are still working in the judiciary, the legislature, prosecutor's office. There are even some in the police organization who really believe in legal values. These things haven't disappeared, and I think we can't abandon these people. We have to try to continue our cooperation as our NYU US Asia Law Institute, despite difficulties, continues to do in various imaginative, energetic ways. So it's not like there's no basis for greater emphasis on the legal system in even the near future in China. But in many respects, in practice, it's being repressed. But if China wants to improve its business relations with the world, it's going to have to continue to improve its relevant legal system there. So there is a legal elite there, and we don't want to let them down, and we want to work with them and encourage them to the extent we can. Rule of law generally, of course, I think Xi Jinping has many critics in China. They're not able to express themselves fully. But I do think that foreign exposure of their problems as well as their progress is useful to them. And that's why I emphasize the need for continuing criticism. What else do you see, Steve, is worth mentioning here as we look at our efforts in retrospect? Obviously, the human rights situation is very severe. I think China has shown some belated sensitivity to harsh criticism, but not enough. Xinjiang continues to be a horrendous violation of public international law. I'd like to see more response from the foreign countries that are concerned with China on this. I published an article late last year in the NYU Journal of International Law and Politics that supports the point you made earlier about China doesn't want to throw out the current international legal system. It wants, like every nation, to shape it to its interests. And we have to be more vigorous, I think, not dropping out of international organizations as we've done with the Human Rights Council and with other organizations, but becoming more active. The legal system, I think, continues to be a critical, if sometimes underestimated element in our relations with China.